This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. We're, of course, speaking hours after a dastardly attack in Pahalgam in Kashmir, where at last count, 27 innocent tourists were murdered by terrorists after checking their religion. I am joined today by my friend Akhil Ramesh, head of the India program at the Pacific Forum. I've invited Akhil to talk about US Vice President J.D.Vance's visit to India and many other issues about the India-US relationship. But of course, this terrible news from Kashmir has overtaken some of this. And we will begin this conversation by talking about what's happening in Kashmir and then go on to talk about the larger India-US relationship. Akhil, welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. First and foremost, my deepest condolences to the families, to all those affected by the dastardly attack in Kashmir.
Thank you very much, Akhil. Much needed at a time like this. Let's begin our conversation talking a little bit about this issue. Then, immediate condemnation has come from the highest office in the United States. And many others, in unequivocally talking about how this actually has no defense and this must be condemned and must be tackled. Talk to me a little bit about how perhaps the Trump administration thinks about issues like this and incidents like this.
Well, terrorism and radical Islamic terrorism has been pushed to the front and center by the DNI, Tulsi Gabbard. A year ago, that would have been unfathomable. For the U.S., a year ago, white supremacy was the number one challenge. Now that has been changed to Islamic terror. I think terrorism is a real threat, and we're not just in 2002, but we're in 2025. I think it's a real threat, as we've seen in Kashmir, unfortunately.
Also, talk to me a little bit about going forward. This has been timed, obviously, to Prime Minister Modi's visit to Saudi Arabia and also especially to US Vice President J.D. Vance's visit to India. Talk to me about a little bit about how this timing will be seen in the US.
Oh, well, for the U.S., the India partnership is important, regardless of the hiccups or the challenges it may face on the way, but the target is there. It is the indispensable partner of the 21st century, and successive administrations have made it clear. But there are irritants, and there are third parties who like to play a spoil sport. So that's what we've seen with Modi's trip to Saudi Arabia and J.D. Vance's trip to India, and this happens. So that's what we've seen there.
One of the big things that have often been spoken about is while there's been a lot of US condemnation and irritation with Pakistan, some of the assistance that it has traditionally received from the US has not entirely stopped. In fact, under an earlier administration, while there were condemnation, but there was also a swing back in a sense of giving support back to Pakistan. And when we say Pakistan, we should make it clear that we are really, the real power there is not the Pakistani government. It is really the Pakistani army, which by its own confession, as Asim Munir, its chief, recently said, is fighting this vast jihadist war with India on the basis of religion. So essentially, it sort of boils down to support to that sort of an establishment. Talk to me a little bit about how the current administration might think about issues like this, including what the Pakistani army chief recently said.
Well, so Pakistan is still remains to be a non-NATO ally of the U.S. Even post-Afghanistan, still Pakistan enjoys that relationship. For that to change, I think it's not just the executive order or for the executive office that is going to change it, but also the level of Congress. So it has to come from the different branches of government for that to change, for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship to be demoted. Usually elevation requires a lot of advocacy, demotion requires news like this. But we will see if the Trump administration sees value in demoting the relationship, because New Delhi is clearly a much more valuable ally, a much more economically and militarily more important ally to the U.S. than Pakistan.
Let's now talk a little bit about this developing relationship. One of the things I wrote in the Pacific Forum, in fact, when the Trump administration came to power and there was all this talk about tariffs, is that much more than tariffs, sovereignty matters to India. And indeed, there's been a series of confidence building measures from the Trump administration, the sending back of Rana, the recent arrest of a noted Sikh extremist from the Khalistan movement by the FBI. Several such moves have been made by the Trump administration, which were very, very critical for the development of the relationship, and that matters much more to India than any tariffs or any economic sort of hurdles that we may face. Talk to me a little bit about this change of shift, because one of the big irritants in the last Democratic administration were things like this. There was constantly this prickly relationship based on all of this. The Indian consulate was set on fire by these Khalistani extremists. There were all of this, but that seems the wind seems to be changing from that era, so to speak.
Yes, clearly. So this administration, the Trump administration, is clear about partnerships and allies. It seeks economic commercial gain in relationships. It does not want to preach. To paraphrase J.D. Vance, it does not want to preach to India. It does not want to dictate terms, nor does it want to talk about democracy. So it is no evangelical democracy promoting organization. The U.S. government is clear; it needs economic gain from relationships. So trade is front and center, and that means better negotiation for the U.S. and better deals, and that would involve tariffs and other instruments. That doesn't mean that it's targeted towards India. As you may have seen, tariffs are a blanket effort. It was targeted to almost over 190 countries, with a base tariff of 10% to going upwards of even 50% to China facing over 100% in some sectors. So tariffs are not an individual weapon used against India. So it is hardly any issue for the U.S. India partnership. It's more of a broader global issue that India is also part of the mix. With regards to the two that you mentioned, that is definitely a significant development for the U.S. India partnership. It is actually has brought the relationship back on track. Under Biden, both the democracy promotion and the undermining of India's efforts, whether was it in its own neighborhood, like Bangladesh and other parts, or it was with, say, the issues like this, with separatism and terrorist activity, the U.S. being a little more softer. I think the Biden led Indian administration down. So the Biden administration was definitely had its own agenda, if I may say, to the region and to the broader subcontinent.
Talk to me a little bit about a question that many people ask in Raisina Hill, so to speak, Akhil. Do you think that under the Trump administration, with people like J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, and others, there is a deeper understanding than perhaps existed with certain quarters in the Biden administration, that India faces very significant sovereignty challenges? After all, it is Pakistan on one side, China on the other, and of course now there's Bangladesh and so on and so forth. So, more than many other issues, this is a dominating issue that constantly, something that India worries about, and therefore cooperation in this regard is going to be highly valued in New Delhi.
Well, to be frank, sovereignty should be every nation's own problem. So New Delhi should prioritize its own sovereignty issues. The U.S., for its part, will take part in any issue that deals with China because it's a shared concern. But besides that, every other sovereignty challenge that India faces, whether it's internal or external, I think it should be New Delhi's own undertaking. In fact, that is a better way of looking at it than asking for a faraway power to come save us, because that never helps the local country. So I believe if the U.S. is more has more restraint. I'll use that word because as scholars of realism and restraint, if U.S. is spends more time thinking about itself and has more appetite for internal affairs and trade relations, and less so for the international affairs that involves democracy building or security issues in the developing world. I think it's better for India to deal with its own mess.
So I wasn't suggesting that the US would, in a sense, assist India in tackling this. What I was suggesting, though, is that if there is cooperation, like for instance, if there are extremists being harbored in a country, like if there are extremists sitting in the US and causing trouble for other countries, including India, that could be tackled. Number one. Number two, on concerns of India's domestic politics should remain within the domestic sphere rather than become a talking point, on the beltway, so to speak.
Yeah, so I'll take the latter one first. So about the domestic politics, yes, the Washington today does not have an appetite for what happens in India, very little. Yeah, but there are voices within India that would like to, use a trumpet and would want power centers across the world to speak about it. So it is partly an internal problem that needs to be addressed. So as for the first point, yes, there needs to be more such action, whether it's Rana, whether it is Khalistani separatism. There needs to be coordinated efforts to address them. At the same time, I do not see it to be the front and center of the relationship because it veers into certain sensitive topics, even for the Trump administration, such as freedom of speech. So America holds freedom of speech dear, and anything that is seen as a violation of freedom of speech, or rather anyone trying to limit it, would be on the wrong side here. So that is a tricky subject. As long as they are listed as a terrorist or as a criminal and are undocumented, as was the case with a gentleman in California, I think the case is easier because that is where the Venn diagram meets. If I were to say the U.S. and India were two, circles, and the Venn diagram meets in undocumented criminal aliens.
Let's talk a little bit about trade then. One of the big things that that has been talked about is this trade deal, and what are the contours of this trade deal, and what could be the contours of the trade deal. There are still some issues, like for instance, dairy and others, which needs negotiation. But this trade deal, at least from the American side, has been spoken of as one of the big outcomes that has been looked at perhaps by the end of the year. Talk to me a little bit about how this trade deal is seen.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, for India, it's on a trade deal spree. It's busy, drawing up agreements with multiple countries across the world, both from South America to Europe to the U.S. So it has an appetite for free trade agreements, is what I'm come to understand. Over the last few years, it is opening up. It is seeing itself as an export nation. Over the last 50 or 60 years, it was limiting itself to be a consumption nation. Now, as it opens itself to as an export nation, it needs to sign more trade agreements. That's a welcome measure. In the context of the U.S., I think there have been few irritants, such as the protectionism in select industries, as you mentioned, whether it's dairy or agriculture, for that matter. But it's not New Delhi's fault. So, once again, to paraphrase the vice president, there are certain domestic challenges, and you have to be a hard negotiator for your own country. Washington is beginning to do the same. So, as India tries to protect its small and medium enterprises, its small scale farmers, the U.S. wants its farmers to have export markets. So it could be a win-win situation if the agreement and the details of it turn out to be beneficial for the consumers and for the population or the populace in the both countries. But it is to be seen how they come to terms with these, tricky sectors, because as you may know, in India, agriculture impacts not just the economy, but the polity and even inflation levels. So any change in the sector, whether it's even a small change in the subsidies that is offered, has national and subsequently a global impact on commodities from rice to sugar to wheat.
In recent weeks, we've seen a flurry of activity, of course, between the US and India, with administrators and key government officials going to and fro. When you saw US Vice President J.D. Vance talk in India, talk to me about the sense you got from the direction that the administration is taking with its India relationship.
No, I saw it as a breath of fresh air because, as a scholar of realism, for me that was music to my ears. Basically, a vice president of the U.S. saying that India is its own power and that we won't be interfering in its affairs. I think that is a breath of fresh air and that is a restart to the relationship. So I'm quite bullish on the relationship, on where it could head. So to be seen how far this can go.
A lot of people also ask that since this is President Donald Trump's second and therefore last term by US rules, this is, this, while it might be a restart, how long it would carry on, depending on what administration comes after President Trump, needs to be calculated and seen. How do you see this aspect?
For starters, I don't know if it'll be limited to two terms. Anything can happen in politics. Changes and amendments can be made. But on a more, if I'm being more pragmatic, I think J.D. Vance is seen as the successor, potential successor. So that could be policy consistency if he were to run in 3 years from now. But again, in politics, there's a lot of unpredictability. If the other side were to come back to power, we don't know if they will maintain the same status quo in the relationship. Will there be the same momentum that will be, capitalized? But one thing is certain: besides the executive, the Congress and the Senate both are, gung ho on U.S. India relations. They are very bullish on India. And 3 years from now, the Democratic Party may not be what it is today. They have to win elections. They have to do their own soul searching and reflecting. Excuse me. So I think they might be a reform party. So if the Democrat Party is no longer the quote unquote woke party that it had turned out, so we might have a better scope for U.S. India relations even under a Democrat regime.
On that very optimistic note, Akhil Ramesh, we will leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time and for talking to me on this vital relationship as it emerges, as it develops in the second term of President Donald Trump and indeed the third term of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. No doubt we will have opportunities to speak to you as this relationship develops. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.